Welcome to the BCEN and Friends podcast, where we hold interesting conversations about learning with a range of thought leaders, BCEN certification holders, and industry professionals. Our goal is to create value and insight for you, our professional nurses across the emergency spectrum. We hope you find our discussions interesting, informative, sometimes funny, sometimes serious, and always worth your time.
Welcome to a special two-part podcast episode. We're excited to introduce the BCEN and Friends Roundtable, featuring three accomplished certified flight nurses, Jonathan Baxter, Caroline Levin, and Jacob Miller. These seasoned flight clinicians are here to share their real-world insights, expert tips, and unique perspectives on the fast-paced world of air transport nursing. From critical clinical scenarios to ethical dilemmas, no topic is off limits. And yes, we're spilling the tea on all things flight. This is part one of our CFRN Roundtable. Get to the chopper.
I'm Holly Briggs, a professional development specialist at BCEN and one of your hosts for today. I'm joined by my co-host, Michael Dexter, Director of Professional Development at BCEN. Hi, Michael.
Hello, Holly.
In this two-part episode, we're joined by three guests who will comprise our CFRN Roundtable: Jonathan Baxter, Caroline Levin, and Jacob Miller. At this table, we have several decades of flight, pre-hospital, and critical care experience, not to mention advanced degrees and certification. We have tons of clinical, professional, and ethical questions to get to in this two-part episode. So best of luck to you, Michael, in introducing these three experts. There's a lot to cover.
Well, thank you, Holly. And let me just jump right in. I'll start with Jonathan Baxter. Jonathan is a chief flight nurse for a critical care transport program in Arkansas, where he oversees clinical operations and actively flies missions. He holds board certifications in trauma, emergency, flight, and critical care nursing, and collaborates with EMS crews, communities, and state regulators, serving as vice chair of the Air Medical Subcommittee and secretary of the EMS Data Committee for the Arkansas Department of Health. As a doctoral candidate at UAMS, his research focuses on how EMS provider qualifications impact patient outcomes. He's also active in several professional organizations and serves as the ENA Trauma Chair for Arkansas. Caroline is a flight nurse and for STAT MedEvac in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Coming from a diverse background in trauma, emergency, and critical care, she brings a unique expertise to the bedside and aims to share her love of nursing and continuing education to the future of flight and transport nursing. Caroline holds certifications in emergency, flight, critical care, and as a pre-hospital specialized RN. And the third one is Jacob Miller. Jacob is a nurse practitioner, clinical nurse specialist, and nationally registered paramedic with over 2 decades of EMS and emergency nursing experience, now specializing in critical care transport medicine. Jacob works as a paramedic, a flight nurse, and a critical care nurse practitioner in the Cincinnati area, in addition to state and national involvement in various professional organizations. So Jonathan, Caroline, and Jacob, welcome to the BCN and Friends podcast and the first Roundtable episode. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks, Michael. Happy to be here.
For having us.
Well, I want to just jump into, as Holly mentioned, some clinical things, some legal things. But before we do that, just a little bit about your backgrounds. You certainly have each taken a different path into flight nursing, and there's not a single route into this field, but based on your experience, there are a lot of nurses that want to be flight nurses. And so starting off with Caroline, is there one key characteristic or one skill that you feel is essential for someone when they come up to you and they say, I want to be a flight nurse? What's a certain characteristic that makes someone a good flight nurse, Caroline?
I think the one word that comes to mind when I think about flight nursing and the path to flight nursing is adaptability. When I went into nursing school, I was dead set on being a pediatric nurse practitioner. Like, that was my career path. That was my goal. That was my end game. And I said I would never go into emergency nursing, right? And then fast forward 2 years, 4 years out of nursing school, I'm like, catch me in an ER. That's where I'm going to be forever. And then once I started getting more interested in flight nursing and things like that, I said to myself, I got to get into some critical care. And to be perfectly honest, when I got to the critical care unit that I started on, I was wildly overwhelmed. I hated it. I was thinking, this is dumb. Why are they doing it this way? It's so much faster or easier to do it this way. And, you really have to kind of buckle down and say, it's not that they're doing it wrong. They're doing it in a way that you're not used to, that you're not comfortable with. And you need to learn to grow through those experiences. Right. And I think that has helped me significantly in my career as flight nursing, because you look at the calls that you get, and looking at a typical shift, you go get an OB patient at 8 a.m., a cardiac patient at noon, a pediatric patient at 2 p.m., and then at midnight, you're doing an ECMO. So you really have to be able to adapt yourself, adapt your learning, and kind of move out of that comfort zone to really get a broad view of what you're looking at.
Well, I think that's a great one to start out with. So, Jacob, I'm interested to hear what you have to say. I totally agree with what you're saying, Caroline. Jacob, what are your thoughts?
I think the other thing to consider with that is just the background experience that you bring to that transport crew. When anyone talks to me about an interest in critical care transport flight, I do strongly recommend getting some solid experience in an intensive care unit. There is a reason that national accreditation organizations put in their accreditation requirements that the transport clinicians have at least 3 years of experience in what they call critical care, which they include both emergency department and ICU. But my recommendation is really to get ICU. And this is coming from someone who was, quote unquote, just an ER nurse before getting into flight. My learning curve on those first, it's basically, the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? So you don't know what you don't know until you figure out like, oh, I didn't know any of this stuff. So I think some of it is you really have to have that solid foundational knowledge, because you're not in a unit where you can necessarily just page the resident on call or walk into the fishbowl and talk to the attending or get an order for this med or that med, or ask the nurse practitioner or PA which of the 3 pain medications you carry they want you to administer. You have to be able to decide. Now, obviously, most nurses, most programs are going to work under some sort of protocol. So you probably have protocols. You cannot protocolize every single patient that we are going to see in the critical care transport environment. So some element of this is you have to rely on your foundational knowledge to decide, okay, we're on 3 pressors right now. Which is the best one to go up on? Should we maybe go off of one? The flight I did literally last night, the patient was being managed on an inotropic medication, and we're like, that is probably not a good choice right now. We need to switch that drug out for a completely different one. And you have to have the background knowledge to be comfortable making those decisions. Obviously, as a new clinician, you may not be. You may have to reach out to medical control, but that discussion really has to have some suggestion, the whole SBAR process, right? Situation, background assessment, and then your recommendation. You have to be able to come up with a recommendation and say, hey, this is what I'm looking at. This is what I'm thinking. Could you just call med control and be like, I have no idea what's going on. I don't know what to do. Sure, I've done that before, but it's helpful to have those recommendations to be able to come up with it, because you're looking at that patient, you're formulating that clinical impression, and really having a high level academic ICU background is probably going to help you with that. I can't say it definitely will, because I didn't have that background, so I can't speak from experience. But I can speak from the experience of coming from a level 1 trauma center and a community hospital emergency department only, and knowing that I had a pretty steep learning curve when I first got into flight. Obviously, I think I made it reasonably successfully, so that's not to say you can't get into flight with just emergency department background. And some of that is also going to depend on the mission profile of the program you end up working for. But I think that would be like the one key takeaway that I would tell folks is please, 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 please strongly consider getting some good high quality, high acuity ICU background before you burst into that transport role.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jacob. I think a lot of programs combine an RN and a paramedic, and the paramedic's generally really good at the pre-hospital emergency stuff. So they kind of look to you to be really good at critical care. And if you've never done it before, it's it's tough. So certainly, adaptability, critical care experience. Jonathan, what are your thoughts on success in the transport industry?
I love both those characteristics. Adaptability was actually going to be mine, so thanks for taking that from me, Caroline. So I'll have to go to my plan B. I think that's a really good point. And kind of what Jacob was talking about, I really feel like autonomy has a role here. Like for me, like you really have to be able to think and work through those processes like Jacob was talking about when you're making these assessments and managing these patients. I've had a little bit of experience working in a level 1 trauma center and then working in a non-academic trauma center. And, those are apples and oranges to me. I feel like the level 1 trauma centers, while you see high acuity patients and you see lots of traumas, there's also lots of residents that are perfecting their craft. And so you kind of wind up on the sidelines looking in a lot, where some of these more non-academic centers, the nurses play a lot more of a role whenever somebody comes in the triage. Like a lot of times it's the RN that's going to be starting the protocols, like a chest pain set or something like that. And so you just see a lot more, and you get to think through those processes and work directly with medicine to make sure that you're making good decisions. And so I think there's a balance between the two of those. Working for a large healthcare system here in Arkansas, like we have lots of ICU nurses and lots of ER nurses to pick from. I think we have around 300 ER nurses in the system and probably maybe 500 ICU nurses. And so we have a really good pool. And what we have found actually is that the ICU nurses require more training to get them up to date for flight because they haven't been really exposed to a lot of different patient populations. They get filtered. And so they really don't get to see a lot of pediatrics or maybe a lot of obstetrics, or if they come from a CCU or a CVICU, then, they're not so familiar with GI bleeds and kind of the way that process would go. And so being extremely specialized, why it's really good. Like we do a lot of CV transfers. And so we love having CVICU nurses on the team because they know a lot about those devices and kind of the expected course for somebody that's, post-CABG that's been botched or something like that. But, they haven't seen a lot of sprained ankles and a lot of people coming in with like back pain that are just the random things that you get exposed to the ED that you have to dig yourself out of. And so it kind of goes both ways. I like what Jacob said. I definitely agree that the critical care transport part of it's, if you have exposure to multiple medications and drips and devices and monitoring parameters, and you're familiar with Swan-Ganz and art lines and how to flush them and manage them, like ER nurses, you have to teach them all that. But I think we go both ways on it. So I kind of think that Jacob's perspective is a little bit different than mine, but I definitely appreciate it.
I can see how it's really like just an enmeshment of bringing ER, intensive care. You have your random patient populations, which, sometimes I'm like, it's kind of like a spin the wheel. Like you just never know what you're going to get, which I feel like that ER mentality kind of brings to you. Cause like, you never know what's going to come in the door. But then there's also this idea that sometimes those patients who are really critically sick require that specialized care. So flight and transport really brings that all together, and it puts you in a place where you have to adapt not only to the environment that you're in and the patient that you have, but then you also have to be able to apply everything everything, realizing what you don't know, which I think that's also a really good point. And oftentimes doing that with very little backup, very little help. It's not like you have a room full of people who are going to be able to ride with you. So I think it takes a really skilled and unique person to be able to pull that off and do it well, and also to grow in that type of environment. I don't think everyone can get planted into flight and transport and grow, but I know that there are people who do and do it really well. I'm obviously speaking to 3 of them on this podcast right now, but I loved y'all's answers, so I appreciate that. Okay, I'm moving on to my question. I love a good hypothetical scenario. I really do. This is kind of like not nursing school, but here's a hypothetical scenario. If you were handed a flight care survival bag, okay, and you were told there's this really sick patient and that's all that you got. I know I'm probably giving you guys all like, oh, this is my patient yesterday. Okay,
you work for my dispatch center.
Right. I'm your dispatch. I need you to get your stuff together, whatever that is. And I want you to go pick up this really sick patient. So what would be the top 3 medicines that you would just be sure to have, and why those 3? So I'm going to start off with Jacob.
So I think, assuming I have, the desert island scenario, right? You only have 3 drugs. You can't get anything else. Your aircraft is gone and you just have what you have in your bag, right? So I think my top 3, I would have to look at something that's kind of like multimodal versatile, because you may be able to use something for multiple different indications. I think, if we're going for a critically unwell patient when we have 0 other information about this person, I think one of the things you're going to have is a vasopressor. And I think that it's reasonable to have norepinephrine as your first line vasopressor for that patient. It's a great first line presser for almost everything. So I think that would probably be my drug number one. Drug number two, I think, would probably be ketamine, because it is illegal to have a emergency or critical care podcast where someone doesn't say the word ketamine. So there it is. So ketamine can cause, it can cause sedation. It can be used at lower doses for an analgesic effect. So there is some versatility built in there. You have sedation, you have analgesia. And then I think the third medication, I'm having a little bit of a hard time kind of trying to figure out exactly what I would want for that. There's other things I'm considering, for example, like maybe, and we're assuming oxygen isn't a drug, like you would have oxygen. Otherwise, you probably would want to have oxygen with you for a sick
You can have
patient.
oxygen.
Okay. If we're calling blood a drug, blood will be my third. And then I think that if we're calling just pharmacology agents drugs, maybe something like I don't know, I just based off of like the missions that I've flown recently, something like maybe a nitroglycerin, where if you don't have to press the patient, maybe you have to bring them down. So it's a nice vasodilator, it's a venodilator at low doses. It's can give you some arterial dilation at really high doses. You can nebulize it if it's an RV thing. So just thinking like cardiac physiology, like maybe something like a nitroglycerin. I don't know. I'm not sold on the third drug, but I think norepi and ketamine would definitely be high on that list.
Well, and thank you, because I didn't want this podcast to be illegal. So thank you for getting that out of the way with the ketamine. I appreciate that. All right, Jonathan, tell me what you got. What's your three meds?
Man, I love Jacob's choices. That's a tough act to follow. I think that whenever I was considering this, I actually considered oxygen as probably my top drug. It's not a given that I'd have it. So I thought, well, I'm probably going to want oxygen. That's going to fix a lot of problems in the field. So if that's a given, that's pretty sweet. But not having oxygen, if you ever run out, if you've been transporting somebody on a D cylinder and whenever that thing goes empty and you're halfway between point A and point B, it's pretty catastrophic. And so O2 and lots of O2 would be one of my top. I think probably I would like some sort of something I can provide some volume, lactated ringers, something like that. And so if I got somebody that was in a lot of situations, fluids, it's not always the right answer, but most of the time it's not the wrong answer. You can give them a little bit of fluids to stay in them. If you kind of have a soft blood pressure or a little tachycardia or something like that, I might try that as just, we'll see how that goes. And then definitely some sort of analgesic medication. Ketamine's a great choice, but, I might even go fentanyl or something that way. As long as I can give somebody some pain management, give them some volume, and maybe give them some oxygen, I kind of thought maybe I would have a reasonable chance of surviving long enough to get to the next resource. It's not everything I would want. I'm sure Jacob's drug bag looks like ours. We just keep adding things to it. And so it's such a pain to check all of these things off because we carry 60 medications now. And so picking my top three was really tough. And I would really want some more information about the patient, but I think those are probably my top.
I'm just the worst dispatcher ever. I basically was like, yeah. They'll take care of it. And I gave you like a little mini MERS to bring your stuff with you. I gave you a mini purse to bring your medicines. I didn't even bring you like a whole bag. You just got three, but I like your choices. All right, Caroline, what you bringing?
So my first question, of course, is, are Jacob, Jonathan, and I all on the same flight, and do we each get to bring three things?
I knew someone was going to ask that question, and you know what? Sure.
Oh, okay. Well, then that drastically changes my answer because all the good answers are taken already.
Well, you can add.
Every time Jacob was like getting ready to say his next med, I was like, oh, what would be good would be ketamine. And then he said ketamine, and I was like, okay, well, let me come up with my own answers here, Jacob. I would think for me, I'm prioritizing blood. I would bring blood on every single transport. I think it's a great resource in many situations, in your trauma patients, in your GI bleeding patients, in your hypotensive patients that maybe just are a little septic and fluid overloaded at that point, just to give them a different type of volume. I'm probably going to prioritize blood on a lot of these patients. I think in our world of HEMS, to kind of backtrack to the last question, our community ambulance services look at us as a resource and look at us as the help us out of trouble card, right? So I think a lot of times those are your trauma patients that have lost a significant amount of volume that need resuscitated before anything else can happen. So I love the answers of blood, some type of fluid resuscitation, but since my partners are bringing those already, I agree with norepinephrine. I would say if we're going to have norepi on board, I'd probably bring like a push dose pressor, maybe like a little epi bump or something like that, or a vasopressor drip. Never want to just give a little push of inotropy and then kind of let it settle, right? We don't want that to wear off. We want to get them out of the hole and then continue the drip after that. So maybe a push dose pressor, definitely blood. And then I also agree with the thought process of bringing pressures down. We've already got nitro. That's okay. I'm thinking maybe aspirin. Your typical just antiplatelet medication, it's good for your STEMIs, which we see a lot of in our population, your CHF patients, things like that. You've got nitro, now you've got aspirin, we got a little volume, we got some oxygen, tons of it because Jonathan's extra prepared. And I think with all 9 of our medications, because I've changed the scenario to fit my needs because I'm adaptable, we're set for anything.
Well, I think those are great choices. I know nobody asked, but I did come up with my own 3, which were norepinephrine, ketamine, and I was going with Plasmolite as my 3rd. But again, nobody asked me. But I think all of your choices were great. Obviously, 2 of my 3 were picked right off the bat. So I'm glad to know I'm not too far away from the island. Maybe I'm just in a rowboat, kind of out in the shallows, getting close. But I think it's cool to see that people that work in different areas of the country all have this very similar focus. And I think the same thing happens with emergency medicine a lot, where people are like, well, my ER just does it this way and nobody else does. And it's crazy. And then you talk to people and are like, no, everybody does it that way. And the HEMS world and the fixed wing world, critical care ground transport, we're all fighting similar battles in different ways. So one of the questions that I wanted to kind of get back into perhaps a less hypothetical, but much more real question that comes up a lot. And this kind of goes back to the other question I asked about nurses that want to get into the industry. One of the questions that often happens in that same regard is, how safe is it? How safe is air medical transport? And there's certainly things that people need to understand about it, and how the crew needs to work together and communicate. And there's those expressions, 3 to go and 1 to say no, and things like that. But it just in terms of the biggest safety risks in flight, what do you see currently still being a safety issue, and how is either local areas or even the industry addressing some of those concerns of safety in flight? And Jonathan, maybe you could take it off first.
Yeah, I mean, it's we can't do it safe. We don't want to do it at all. And that's definitely number one. We got to take care of the providers. We got to take care of the patient. For me, probably the biggest concern that I have amongst our program is complacency. Like, it gets real easy to see this routine go out every day. Like, we're going out and we're doing, we're checking all these boxes and checking medications off and checking safety off. And every day you get through that and you get used to this routine that happens, and then you get complacent with it. And then, you're not really focused in on actually what you're doing. You're just checking the boxes. I think whenever you're getting ready to lift off, you're doing a walk around to make sure all the latches are closed and everything's secured, or, not tying your med bag down, or securing things to the floor, like all of these little bitty things. Like, if you have an in-air event and you have to have an evasive maneuver, if the monitor is not tied down, that's a projectile. Like, that could really harm somebody, if not kill them, if it's done. And so I'll get in with my team and I'll fly and I'll see like these little things that they've just taken for granted. Like, you really do have to secure that. Like, there's a reason why we do these things, but you get away from it because you do it so frequently that you just kind of forget that it is important. And so we try to bring that up with our pre-mission briefs when we sit down with the pilot and the mechanic every shift, and we'll kind of go over things. And complacency is always right there at the very top, being like, don't sleep on these things and don't get soft on them because they sneak up on you and they can bite you. And unfortunately, seems like every year or so we'll be reminded of that. Somebody getting into an LZ that's a little too tight because they've landed there a dozen times. Like, we've been here, we come to this volunteer fire department, and we sit down, and we've never liked the LZ, but we keep doing it. And one day it really does become a problem. So I think that would probably be my top one. And I don't know, I really have a clear answer on how to mitigate that entirely. I think it's really tough because it's such a slow burn. Like, it just sneaks up on you, it seems like.
Yeah, absolutely. It's tough, and it's been a problem for a while. Caroline, what are your thoughts?
I definitely agree. I think complacency is the biggest factor. I think HEMS in general has changed significantly over the last couple of years. I think programs are busier, programs are popping up everywhere. In my area alone, there 3 or 4 different flight companies that could all be operating in the same airspace at the same time. And we have anywhere between 5 aircraft to a company to 18 aircraft to a company. And really having that mentality of eyes out, if you're not involved in patient care, you're looking around, you're aware of your surroundings. And then to Jonathan's point, I think the complacency aspect of things, it really wears on people after a while as well. So I think making sure that you're not only taking care of yourself, but also taking care of your crew members. Hey, I think you look a little tired after this one. Do you need a break? Do you need something to eat? Let's take a respite for 20 minutes and just get ourselves together before we move on and things like that. And then with the complacency, I think from a generational viewpoint that I've noticed lately is I feel like the new generation that's coming out, myself included, because everybody's guilty of the like cool selfie in the helicopter, or like, oh, look at the rainbow, like that's so pretty. But I think there's this shift in the world in general that everything is so social media driven. Let me take a picture of this. Let me post this on my Instagram or my Facebook or whatever. And I think we lose sight of what we're actually supposed to be doing, which is paying attention during our walkarounds, using a real flashlight instead of a cell phone flashlight, because your real flashlight can't pop up with a text message and distract you during your walkaround, right? Phones away while you're taking care of a patient, because when that patient flips into VTAC and you're scrolling on your phone, trying to post your latest picture, you might miss that. And I think that's very generational. I think we're so ingrained in social media and the internet and things these days that it's very easy to get lost in what the actual mission is, and to stay hyper vigilant, take care of yourself, take care of your partners, take care of the patients, and remain safe in your seatbelts, visors down, those types of things.
Great point, Caroline. I've heard a lot of people in the air medical industry recently talking about the social media and the selfies and some of the concerns that they have for how that's really gotten into this space in particular. Jacob, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I absolutely completely agree with that complacency and being present. We are not finding new and unique ways to kill ourselves in air medical and ground medical, right? We're doing the same things over and over again. I do think, rather than being a third person to say complacency and all that sort of stuff, right? Like, I think the other part of this is, George Bernard Shaw said, the single greatest problem with communication is the illusion that it's occurred. I think communication is also a key here. And especially as a newer clinician, you may not want to be the one to, wait, was that vibration normal or not normal? I don't want to, call that out if that's just a normal part of this. Like, it smells something, but I'm sure it's probably normal, right? And you can easily talk yourself into not asking the question, not speaking up, not saying something. And I think that's where we need to kind of pause, regroup, and just normalize communicating with each other. When in doubt, over communicate. And I'm not talking about like communicating about like, oh, hey, I hope we're going to this hospital because they've got the best EMS room snacks and all that sort of stuff during one of those critical phases of flight. But don't be complacent, be present, especially in those critical phases of flight, right? Your taxi, takeoff, landing, all that sort of stuff. For our ground critical care transport colleagues, during those critical phases, right? Lights and sirens, operations, clearing intersections, all those types of things. You need to be present. You can't be complacent during those times. Then over communicate. Make sure that you are calling out what you're seeing when you're taking care of the patient, because that also, obviously safety, we typically look at it as like safety of the aircraft, safety of us, but also safety of that patient. If I'm thinking something about my patient's clinical scenario, I need to make sure that my partner is thinking the same thing. Even more importantly, that my partner isn't seeing a different piece of data that I don't see, and they're thinking something completely different. So you absolutely need to communicate bidirectionally or tridirectionally or quadridirectionally, however many people are on your crew, right? Everybody's got to be communicating so that everyone's on the same page. Everybody has an idea of what's going on. And make sure that if you're not sure about something, especially I'm talking to the newer folks as well as the seasoned folks, if you're not sure about something, call it out. If you have a question, ask it. There's the idiom or the expression that like there's no such thing as a dumb question. There's a lot of inquisitive idiots, but there's no such thing as a dumb question. But call that out and ask the questions. And you might feel dumb if you ask a question. It might be a dumb question, but you have to ask it to learn, because if you don't ask it now, the next time you encounter that, you're not going to know the answer to that question. I have asked a lot of dumb questions in my career, and I've asked a lot of questions that were actually really important that I thought were dumb at the time. So don't be afraid to do that. I think one of the biggest take homes from critical care transport, and you've heard it with complacency, you've heard it with communication, you have to leave the ego at the door. You have to be able to be humble and say that, listen, I am part of this. Our pilots tell us on our daily brief every single day, we don't crash in compartments, right? If they're not communicating up front, but we're communicating really well in the back, it's not like just the front of the aircraft is going to crash, right? Something that they do or that we do, depending on what part of the aircraft you're in, will affect the entire team dynamic. So we have to be able to communicate with each other. We have to drop the complacency. We have to be present for that. We have to, like Caroline said, get off the cell phones, although they're always in airplane mode, right, when you're flying. Of course, right? Yes. Yeah. So, but we absolutely have to be present for this, because there is a lot of that normalization of deviance and that drift from what we should be doing. And you could get into an entire PhD dissertation on all the human factors that probably lead into a lot of these incidents and accidents that we are seeing both in air and on ground. But at the heart of it, I think that it is, complacency, it's communication, and yeah, once in a while, it's some sort of catastrophic failure that nobody would have seen, but that is by and large the absolute smallest portion, I think, of all of the things that are going on. I think that a lot of this is human factors, that failure to communicate, that failure to talk to each other, that failure to call things out, and that failure to remain vigilant and avoid that drift into complacency.
The great answers, all of you guys, and really kind of fleshing that out a little bit, because I think a lot of times when you hear about some type of event or an accident and you're just like, your heart just catches in your throat and you're like, oh my goodness, how could something like this happen? And the truth is, someone's going to dive into that. There will be a reason behind it. Hopefully something comes out where we can, again, learn. But I think at the end of the day, it still doesn't make it better, right? Because that people were harmed, lots of people lose their life, and it's just even if we learn, it still doesn't make up for the loss of life and the harm. And I think it's really heartbreaking when it's like, man, if somebody would have just asked the right question, if somebody would have felt brave enough to like call something out, and to your point, I think when you're new in a new environment, you don't want to be like the trouble. You don't want to be the stupid question asker. And so like, even just having the confidence to say that. And I love that, you guys who are all seasoned are like, no, we would rather you ask and us say, no, that's fine, than for you not to ask and something get missed. And also, again, it builds that rapport of we're all here for one purpose, and it's not to build each other's ego. It's to safely go up, come down, finish, and get home to our families. So I think when you have that kind of as the goal, it makes it a little bit easier. So, man, great answers.
Yeah. I want to something to what Jacob had to add. I really do like what he was saying. And I think that there's a problem that's going on that I'm observing, is that a lot of these crew members are normalizing bad behaviors, being on that cell phone and not being present in that phase of flight. And we're not calling each other out or communicating that this is a really, really bad habit. And so that kind of spreads like wildfire. Like next thing you know, nobody's paying attention. And so normalizing these bad behaviors, this complacency, this not being present or being in your phone, or all of those things are just, I think we're all absolutely observing that. And so I don't know how we can light a fire underneath somebody to really make them say, if you see somebody doing this, like, you need to make sure that you call that out. There is no bad questions, and you're not wrong for asking these people to be back present and have their eyes out of the aircraft. I think that's a big piece that may be missing.
I think the other thing is, and I forget the exact number, but the early days of CRM, when they were looking into crew resource management, for those that may not be familiar, right? So that basically that concept of that sharing of information where you flatten the hierarchy, right? The pilot in command is technically in command of your aircraft, but if it's a safety related issue, the brand new flight medic, flight nurse is just as much authority to call something out as that seasoned pilot. And in the early days of CRM from the aviation, I think it was some staggering statistic where I can't even call out the number, but we'll just say the majority of the time, in a lot of the aircraft incidents and accidents that they were looking at, someone in that cockpit or someone in that crew had a vital piece of information that if they had shared it, would have probably drastically changed the outcome of that event. And that's something we really have to harp on. So if it may not even be asking a question, it may just be calling something out that you are looking at, that you are seeing. You're pretty sure the pilot has that traffic that's coming at you, but do they? You're pretty sure the pilot sees that little light that's flashing, but do they? You're pretty sure your partner noticed that the patient's blood pressure is declining, but do they? So just calling out that piece of information that you are observing doesn't even have to be a question. Hey, the blood pressure is now 90/50. It was just 120/80. Just calling out that piece of information so that everybody is on the same page. Because that may be something like, oh yeah, I know I might have been a little bit overzealous on the fentanyl or whatever. But it might also be like, oh no, we should look into that. What's going on? And it gets back to that, what I was saying before about that shared mental model. You have to be able to understand kind of what everybody's looking at, because that's absolutely vital to everything we do, whether it's aviation, whether it's clinical medicine, whether it's operations, whatever. We have to have that shared mental model. So share that information freely at the risk of oversharing information.
This might be the second time I've said it, but to feel confident enough that they understand my motive is so everybody gets where they need to go and we all get home and the patient as well. And so I think, again, creating that, oftentimes it has to start with the person who's seen as kind of like the leader, whether that's the formal leader or the informal leader, just being accepting of that. Like, it's okay to ask questions, come bring it up. I would rather hear from it and figure it out together than for you to sit on it, because again, it breaks my heart to hear that the safety of a crew could have been saved, could have had a better outcome if that one person would have just felt empowered to speak up. So, man, great discussion.
I think too is like I don't want to see the senior provider or the seasoned provider or whatever, but those of us who have been doing it for a long time, when you're paired with someone who's new and you as the quote unquote seasoned provider ask the perceived dumb question, right? Like, I'm the one that's like, oh, do you see Southwest up there at 40,000 feet? And then, the next flight, the new provider may say like, hey, I remember that seasoned provider I was with asked about an airplane. Maybe I'll ask about this one over here that's 500 feet above us, kind of thing, right? And it kind of gives them that empowerment to say like, hey, I saw somebody else ask what I thought was kind of a silly question or a dumb question, and nobody gave them a hard time about it. Maybe that means I could ask a dumb or silly question too. And I think it's interesting because in my world, in my company, when I'm up front, I'm always asking questions. What's that number mean? What does that mean? Why did that number go to that night? And sometimes I think it drives the pilots nuts, but at the same time, they've answered every single one of my questions. No one has ever said to me, you don't need to know what that number means. They'll say, oh, that's the engine power, that's how much fuel we have, or this is the in-ground effect versus the out-of-ground effect. And people are willing to answer questions for you. And I always tell people, I will teach you anything that you want to know. I will teach you anything that you want to know, from how I tie my boots to the easiest way to load the stretcher to why I knew that patient was going to drop their blood pressure when we gave whatever medication. But you have to ask, and you have to feel empowered to ask. And I think from the seasoned provider standpoint, we have to be vigilant in giving honest answers and making the other people feel as though they are able to ask those questions as they progress through their career.
Y'all, we are recording this in July. Let's just call out the obvious. We are good at this as nurses, right? Like, take this into a hospital scenario. You've got that brand new intern that is not paying attention to what you're trying to put down about your patient. I think we are all, as nurses, pretty good at like following the process, writing them, reiterating what we're seeing, suggesting the orders that we want, escalating to the senior resident, to the attending if we need to. I think we're actually all really good at that. We just need to take those skills that we know and transfer them into this new environment. And I think that there's, just because you can be that new person at some point in transport, You just have to have the ability to translate that and to be humble and to say that I am the new person. Now I'm that new intern that doesn't know what I'm doing. Because most of those interns turn into really, really great doctors over the year. And I'd like to think that some of that is because we as nurses help to shape that. Obviously, they have their medical training and they have their medical model that they also follow that helps to shape them. But I think we probably bear into that as well, too. High caution to the physician that doesn't pay attention to the nurses. There's a lot of horror stories there. But I think that that's one of those things that we can then take those skills and translate them into this new environment, into transport, and say, no, we're actually good at this. I know how to call stuff out. I know how to ask questions. I know how to challenge until I get a response that I'm satisfied with. So do that. Don't allow the fact that this is a different environment to change the fact that you need to advocate for your safety, for your patient's safety.
Stay tuned for the second part of this CFRN Roundtable, coming to you soon. In the meantime, I'm Holly Briggs, here with Michael Dexter, and on behalf of the entire BCEN team, we thank and celebrate you for all that you're doing as professional nurses across the emergency spectrum. Until next time, we are out.